The journey into the heart of the Holocaust did not begin with ideology, speeches, or uniforms, but with movement, forced movement. The grinding, mechanical displacement of human bodies across a continent that had decided they were no longer human. For those marked for Auschwitz, the first rupture with reality occurred long before the gates came into view. It began in railway yards, in the echoing hollows of stations sealed off from public sight, where cattle cars stood waiting, silent and already contaminated by fear. Into these wooden boxes, designed for livestock and cargo, 90, sometimes 100 people were forced inside. The doors were slammed shut from the outside. No windows, no ventilation, a single bucket, if that. The journeys lasted anywhere from 24 to 60 hours, sometimes longer, depending on bombed tracks, military priorities, or sheer indifference. There was no clean water, no sanitation, no space to lie down. People fainted standing up. Children cried until they no longer had the strength to cry. The living were pressed against the dying, and the dead were kept upright by the pressure of bodies around them. Time dissolved inside those cars. Hours lost meaning. Darkness became total. The air grew thick with ammonia, sweat, excrement, panic. Some suffocated before the train ever reached its destination. Others lost their grip on reality, whispering prayers, names, fragments of memories, as though reciting them might anchor them to life. By the time the train slowed, by the time the metal wheels screamed against the tracks and the doors were finally wrenched open, those who stumbled out were no longer civilians, no longer citizens of any nation. They were already halfway erased. Birkenau greeted them not with silence, but with sound. Shouting, dogs barking, boots striking gravel. Orders screamed in German, a language many did not understand, delivered with absolute urgency and zero explanation. Floodlights cut through the night. Smoke hung low in the air, carrying a smell that no one could immediately identify, but that would later become unforgettable. The selection platform was chaos organized with terrifying efficiency. SS officers stood with sticks or gloved hands, directing people left or right. No discussion, no appeals, no information. A gesture of a thumb determined whether someone would be worked to death over months or murdered within hours. Families were torn apart in seconds, mothers separated from children, husbands from wives. The old and sick were marked almost instinctively, as if weakness radiated visibly from their bodies. It was here in 1944 that Eva Moses Kor and her twin sister Miriam stood holding hands, too young to understand the mechanics of what was happening, but old enough to feel its finality. Their mother was pulled in one direction, they were pulled in another. There was no goodbye, no final embrace, no explanation. That moment, brief and unceremonious, was the last time they would ever see their parents. The separation was not dramatic. That was its cruelty. It happened quickly, efficiently, without sentiment. Around them, the platform continued to churn with human traffic, as though nothing remarkable had occurred. Then came a different call. Zwillinge, Zwillinge, twins. The word cut through the confusion like a signal flare. Children who had survived the initial selection were suddenly marked again, not for survival, but for something else entirely. Eva and Miriam were swept aside, removed from the flow of prisoners, and handed over to a separate system operating within Auschwitz, a system governed by obsession, ideology, and a man who saw human beings not as lives, but as data. Dr. Josef Mengele did not resemble the caricature of a monster. He was educated, articulate, immaculately dressed. He whistled, he smiled, he carried candy in his pockets for children. This outward normalcy made him far more dangerous. To Mengele, twins represented a shortcut to scientific proof. If racial theory could be demonstrated through controlled comparison, then twins were the ideal laboratory. Differences could be induced, damage could be measured, death could be justified as progress. He referred to his subjects not as patients, but as material, guinea pigs, biological resources to be consumed in service of an imagined future. The Auschwitz complex itself mirrored this industrial logic. It was not a single camp, but an integrated system. Auschwitz I functioned as the administrative and disciplinary center. Auschwitz II, Birkenau, was the primary extermination site, designed explicitly for mass murder on a scale never before attempted. Auschwitz III Monowitz supplied slave labor to German industry, most notably IG Farben, whose chemical plants depended on the slow destruction of human bodies to remain profitable. The camps were linked by rail, bureaucracy, and ideology, forming a machine that converted people into ash, labor, or experimental results. Medical experimentation was not a side activity. It was embedded into the structure of the camps. Nazi racial ideology demanded proof. Eugenics required data. Military planners wanted answers to questions about endurance, survival, and efficiency. Camp clinics became laboratories where ethical boundaries were not merely crossed, but erased entirely. In Block 10 of Auschwitz, and in camps like Dachau and Ravensbrück, prisoners were subjected to procedures that bore no resemblance to medicine. Blood was transfused between incompatible donors to observe coagulation failure. Bones, muscles, and nerves were removed without anesthesia to study regeneration, a concept already disproven, but pursued anyway in the hope of ideological validation. At Dachau, freezing experiments were conducted under the supervision of the Luftwaffe. Prisoners were submerged in ice water for hours, while doctors measured body temperature decline with clinical detachment. Others were forced to stand naked outdoors in sub-zero conditions, exposed to wind and snow, their suffering meticulously recorded. Rewarming experiments followed, some involving boiling water, others involving sexual contact forced upon female prisoners in a grotesque attempt to observe recovery responses. Many died. Those who survived carried irreversible damage. High-altitude experiments pushed human tolerance beyond survivable limits. Prisoners were sealed into low-pressure chambers designed to simulate altitudes up to 68,000 feet. As oxygen levels dropped, they convulsed, lost consciousness, and suffocated, while doctors observed and took notes. These deaths were not accidents. They were anticipated outcomes. Each one was considered a successful data point. Sterilization experiments were equally systematic. Karl Klauberg injected caustic chemicals directly into women's reproductive organs, causing extreme pain, infection, and permanent damage. High-dose X-rays were directed at male and female genitalia, resulting in radiation burns and long-term mutilation. The goal was efficiency, how to prevent reproduction on a mass scale with minimal resources. For twins like Eva and Miriam, daily life followed a brutal rhythm disguised as routine. Several days a week, they were kept naked for hours while every part of their bodies was measured, compared, charted. On other days, they were taken to blood laboratories where circulation was restricted, samples extracted, and injections administered without explanation. No consent was sought, no diagnoses were given. Pain was incidental, fear was constant. After one injection, Eva collapsed with fever. Red spots spread across her body. She shook uncontrollably. Mengele examined her briefly and declared she had 2 weeks to live. She was moved to a hospital barrack, a place where most entered but few left. There, dehydrated and delirious, she crawled across the floor to reach a water faucet, losing consciousness repeatedly along the way. She survived not because of treatment, but because of defiance. A single thought repeated in her mind, over and over, anchoring her to life. She must survive. Decades later, the consequences of those experiments surfaced fully. Miriam's kidneys never developed properly. They failed in adulthood. Eva donated one of her own kidneys to save her sister, an act that closed a circle begun in a place designed to destroy both of them. Not all scientific work in the camps served Nazi goals directly. Some prisoners turned knowledge into resistance. In Buchenwald, Jewish biologist Dr. Ludwig Fleck was forced to work on a typhus vaccine under the supervision of incompetent Nazi physician, known among prisoners as Dr. Dummkopf. Fleck recognized an opportunity. Along with a group of prisoners posing as scientists, he sabotaged production. Fake vaccines were shipped to German troops. Real vaccines were secretly produced for inmates, marked discreetly to ensure they reached the right hands. For 16 months, the Nazi war effort was quietly undermined from within. Daily life for the majority of prisoners, however, followed a different trajectory. Most descended slowly into what camp slang called the Muselmann state, total physical and mental exhaustion. Bodies wasted away. Eyes became fixed, vacant. Prisoners worked 12-hour shifts under constant violence. Hygiene collapsed. Disease spread unchecked. Dysentery killed those too weak to reach latrines. Periodic selections removed the sick and the exhausted, sending them to the gas chambers. Trauma disrupted basic biological functions. Menstruation ceased. Time collapsed into survival measured meal by meal, step by step. Liberation in 1945 did not end the story, it exposed it. The doctor's trial in 1947 attempted to impose moral order on what had occurred, producing the Nuremberg Code, a framework insisting on voluntary consent and the avoidance of unnecessary suffering. Yet the data generated by these crimes remains contested. Some argue it should never be used, others claim ignoring it sacrifices lives. The debate continues, unresolved. For survivors like Eva Moses Kor, resolution was not found in courts or codes, but internally. Decades later, she confronted former Nazi doctor Hans Munch,
and asked him to document the truth of what he had witnessed. She chose forgiveness not as absolution, but as liberation. In 1995, standing in Auschwitz, she declared amnesty, asserting that while the past cannot be changed, one's relationship to it can. It wasn't forgetting, it was reclaiming power from a system designed to annihilate it. The declaration of amnesty did not erase the past, nor was it meant to. The camps did not dissolve into abstraction once the gates were opened and the cameras arrived. What remained afterward was not silence, but residue, embedded in bodies, in memories, in institutions, and in the very language used to describe what had happened. Liberation revealed scenes so extreme that even seasoned soldiers struggled to comprehend them. Survivors emerged skeletal, diseased, disoriented, many unable to understand that the guards were gone. For some, freedom itself was incomprehensible. The machinery that had governed every second of their existence had vanished overnight, leaving behind a vacuum where instinct and identity had been systematically dismantled.
As the physical structures of the camps receded into ruins, their psychological architecture persisted, invisible yet endearing. For survivors, Auschwitz did not remain confined to geography. It followed them into new countries, new languages, new lives. Trauma was not stored as a single memory, but distributed across the nervous system, embedded in reflexes, expectations, and patterns of vigilance. A sudden noise could summon the selection ramp. The smell of smoke could collapse decades. Authority figures triggered instinctive fear, regardless of context. Survival had rewired perception. This rewiring complicated reintegration into societies eager to normalize. Neighbors expected gratitude. Employers expected productivity. Governments expected assimilation. The survivor, meanwhile, navigated a world whose rules had once betrayed them completely. Trust was no longer default. Optimism felt naive. The future, once weaponized as a threat, remained suspect. Medical experimentation survivors faced additional burdens. Their bodies carried consequences that medicine struggled to categorize. Chronic pain without clear etiology, organ damage decades removed from its cause, reproductive harm that erased possibilities before they were consciously imagined. Doctors asked questions survivors could not answer because the procedures inflicted upon them had never been explained, documented, or acknowledged as legitimate medical acts. The clinical language required to describe injury did not exist for crimes disguised as science. This absence of language mirrored a broader epistemological rupture. The Holocaust challenged foundational assumptions about modernity itself. Enlightenment ideals had promised that rationality and scientific progress would reduce cruelty. Auschwitz demonstrated the opposite, that rational systems, when decoupled from ethics, could optimize cruelty with unprecedented efficiency. Gas chambers were not primitive, they were engineered. Selection processes were not chaotic, they were procedural. Death itself was bureaucratized. Within this system, Nazi medicine occupied a privileged role. Physicians functioned as arbiters of life and death, legitimizing selections with clinical authority. A glance, a gesture, a note in a ledger could condemn someone to immediate extermination. This power did not corrupt gradually. It was assumed eagerly by many who believed themselves engaged in national service. The oath to heal was subordinated to ideology. Professional identity was redefined. Post-war attempts to isolate responsibility often focused on notorious figures like Joseph Mengele, transforming them into symbols of aberration. This personalization obscured the scale of participation. Mengele operated within an ecosystem that enabled him. Laboratories required supplies, experiments required approval, data required dissemination. None of this occurred in isolation. The system rewarded compliance and punished dissent. Those who refused participation risked marginalization or worse. But refusal was not impossible. Some did refuse. Their existence proved that alternatives, however costly, remained available. This realization destabilized comforting narratives. If alternatives existed, then participation was not inevitable. It was chosen, often rationalized, often incremental, but chosen nonetheless. This insight forced uncomfortable questions about moral agency under authoritarianism. How much pressure absolves responsibility? Where does coercion end and complicity begin? The Holocaust did not answer these questions definitively. It exposed their complexity. For survivors, these debates were often academic. Their reality was embodied. Memory lived in muscle tension, in disrupted sleep, in hyper-awareness. Many avoided hospitals whenever possible, associating them with harm rather than care. Others pursued medical professions themselves, driven by a desire to reclaim what had been weaponized against them. Both responses reflected attempts to regain control over systems that had once rendered them powerless. Education about the Holocaust expanded globally, but transmission introduced distortion. Visual representations emphasized shocking imagery, sometimes at the expense of explanation.
Piles of shoes, suitcases, hair, symbols powerful yet abstracted from the processes that produce them. Without context, horror risked becoming spectacle. The challenge was not to shock, but to connect. This connection required sustained attention to mechanisms: how laws redefined citizenship, how propaganda normalized exclusion, how neighbors adapted to disappearance, how professionals justified participation through technical language. These processes were gradual, often invisible to those within them. Understanding them required resisting the temptation to frame perpetrators as fundamentally different from ordinary people. The concept of ordinary perpetrators unsettled audiences. It disrupted moral distancing. It suggested continuity rather than rupture. If those who built and operated Auschwitz were not monsters but functionaries, then the conditions that produced them demanded scrutiny. This insight transformed the Holocaust from a historical anomaly into a diagnostic lens for modern societies. Survivors like Eva Moses Kor occupied a unique position within this discourse. As both victim and educator, she navigated the tension between personal truth and public expectation. Audiences often sought catharsis or moral clarity. Her story offered neither neatly. Instead, it exposed endurance without triumph, suffering without redemption, and forgiveness without reconciliation. Her emphasis on personal agency after atrocity challenged deterministic views of trauma. She did not deny damage, she acknowledged it fully, but she refused to let it dictate the totality of her identity. This stance resonated with some and alienated others. It forced confrontation with the uncomfortable reality that healing is not standardized, and that moral authority does not reside exclusively in anger. The backlash against her forgiveness revealed deep cultural investment in certain narratives of justice. Punishment, condemnation, and remembrance often feel safer than ambiguity. Forgiveness without absolution disrupts these frameworks. It refuses closure while asserting autonomy. It shifts focus from perpetrators to survivors without erasing accountability. This reframing had implications beyond individual psychology. It influenced how societies conceptualized resilience. Resilience was not endurance alone, nor was it recovery to a prior state. It was adaptation under permanent alteration. Survivors did not return to who they were. They became something else, shaped by loss but not defined solely by it. As Holocaust memory entered its later phase, institutional stewardship increased. Governments funded memorials, universities established research centers, international organizations codified genocide prevention frameworks, yet implementation lagged behind rhetoric. Genocides occurred after Auschwitz, often met with hesitation rather than intervention. The lessons had been learned but not internalized. This gap exposed a central paradox. Remembrance does not guarantee prevention. Knowledge does not ensure action. Moral clarity does not translate automatically into political will. The Holocaust became a reference point invoked after failure rather than a guide consulted beforehand. Within this context, the role of individual conscience regained prominence. The camps demonstrated how systems suppress conscience through fragmentation of responsibility. No single person felt responsible for the outcome. Each performed a task. Together, they produced annihilation. Countering this dynamic required cultivating moral awareness that resisted compartmentalization. Education efforts increasingly emphasized ethical decision-making, bystander intervention, and critical thinking. Students were asked not only what they would have done, but what they might do now. This shift reframed Holocaust education as preparation rather than commemoration. The physical remnants of Auschwitz continued to anchor these discussions. The barracks, the ruins of gas chambers, the watchtowers, these structures resisted abstraction. They insisted on materiality. They grounded memory in place. Yet even here, interpretation varied. Some visitors sought emotional impact. Others sought historical detail. Some confronted discomfort. Others deflected it. Preservation itself became an ethical act. Decisions about conservation reflected values. What to restore, what to let decay, what to explain, what to leave silent. Each choice shaped how future generations would understand what had occurred. The silence embedded in the site carried its own weight. Silence where orders had been shouted. Silence where machinery had roared. Silence where screams had once been absorbed by walls to contain them. This absence was not emptiness. It was accumulation of what could not be fully articulated. The story of Holocaust medical experimentation remained particularly resistant to closure. Its implications extended into contemporary debates about research ethics, consent, and vulnerability. Every scandal involving unethical experimentation echoed its legacy. Every policy protecting human subjects traced lineage to its failure. Yet vigilance waned. Ethical frameworks were tested by emergencies, wars, pandemics. Exceptions were proposed, shortcuts justified. Each justification echoed past rationalizations. The lesson was not that history repeats identically, but that it rhymes through logic rather than form. The Holocaust persisted not because it demanded remembrance, but forgetting it would confirm the assumptions that enabled. Dehumanization, when normalized, does not announce itself as evil. It presents as efficiency, security, necessity. Auschwitz revealed where such logic leads when unchallenged. The journey that began in darkness did not resolve into light. It opened into responsibility. Responsibility to question systems. Responsibility to resist normalization of harm. Responsibility to recognize humanity where ideology denies it. This responsibility did not belong to survivors alone. It transferred, generation by generation, to those willing to engage honestly with the past without seeking comfort from it. The measure of remembrance lay not in reverence but in vigilance. As decades passed, the Holocaust began to exist in two parallel realities. In one, it lived vividly within the bodies and memories of survivors, an ever-present force shaping perception, health, relationships, and identity. In the other, it became an object of study, curated into timelines, exhibits, academic frameworks, and moral lessons. These realities intersected but never fully aligned. The gap between lived trauma and institutional memory widened with each generation. For survivors, the act of being remembered by institutions often felt impersonal. Their experiences were filtered through educational objectives, political sensitivities, and narrative constraints. Complexity was streamlined, ambiguity was minimized. The rawness of survival was softened to fit pedagogical needs. This was not malicious, it was structural. Institutions prefer clarity, trauma resists it. Auschwitz itself became a symbol that threatened to eclipse the specificity of what occurred within its fences. The name stood for countless camps, ghettos, and killing sites, each with distinct mechanisms and histories. This symbolic compression risked erasing difference in the name of universality. Survivors noticed. They understood that memory, when generalized, can lose its teeth. The medical crimes of the camps exemplified this tension. Often summarized as experiments, they were anything but. They were acts of violence cloaked in scientific language, conducted without hypotheses grounded in good faith inquiry. Many lacked even basic methodological rigor. Data was contaminated by cruelty, ideology, and disregard for variables. To call these acts experiments was to grant them legitimacy they did not deserve. Yet the perpetrators insisted on that legitimacy. They saw themselves as professionals operating at the frontier of knowledge. Their self-image survived defeat. During interrogations and trials, many expressed regret only that their work had been interrupted or misunderstood. Few acknowledged the humanity of their victims. This detachment revealed how thoroughly ideology had replaced empathy. The trials themselves were limited instruments. They established precedent but could not encompass the full scope of harm. Many perpetrators were never prosecuted. Others received sentences that survivors perceived as inadequate. Justice, even when pursued, felt partial. Legal accountability addressed actions, not the systems that produced them. This limitation forced survivors to confront a reality few societies openly acknowledge. Justice is often incomplete. Closure is rare. Moral repair does not always align with legal outcomes. Survivors learned to live with unresolved anger, unanswered questions, and the knowledge that some crimes would never be fully reckoned with. In response, many turned inward. They built private frameworks of meaning that did not depend on external validation. Some found purpose in family, work, or faith. Others in education, activism, or testimony. Still others chose silence, not as avoidance, but as preservation. Silence, too, can be intentional. Eva Moses Core rejected silence, but she also rejected the expectation that survivors should embody perpetual suffering. Her public presence complicated audience expectations. She was articulate, assertive, and unapologetic. She refused to perform trauma on demand. This refusal unsettled those who equated authenticity with visible pain. Her emphasis on forgiveness functioned as a boundary. It signaled that her story was not open for appropriation into narratives she did not choose. Forgiveness was her language of control. It marked where public consumption ended and personal sovereignty began. This assertion of sovereignty exposed an uncomfortable truth. Society often claims ownership over survivor narratives. Their stories are treated as collective property, shaped to serve moral instruction. When survivors deviate from expected scripts, discomfort follows.
As the 20th century moved forward, Auschwitz did not recede into history so much as it embedded itself into the architecture of modern consciousness. It became a reference point, not because it was unique in cruelty, but because it revealed the logical conclusion of systems that prized order, efficiency, and obedience above ethical restraint. The camp was not chaos, it was organization weaponized against life. This distinction matters. Chaos implies loss of control. Auschwitz was control perfected. Every transport was scheduled, every barrack accounted for, every body categorized, measured, and evaluated. Death itself was regulated, even disposal followed protocol. The system did not erupt spontaneously, it evolved through committees, memos, budgets, and approvals. Ordinary administrative tools produced extraordinary harm. The individuals who staffed the camp rarely perceived themselves as villains. Many saw themselves as specialists, technicians, or civil servants fulfilling designated roles. Moral responsibility dissolved across layers of hierarchy. Each participant handled only a fragment of the process. The fragmentation itself became a shield against conscience. Language played a critical role in this fragmentation. Euphemisms replaced realities. Deportation meant removal. Selection meant sorting. Treatment meant experimentation. These linguistic buffers softened the emotional impact of actions, allowing perpetrators to operate without confronting consequences directly. Words did not merely describe reality, they reshaped it. This manipulation of language extended beyond the camp. Official reports obscured outcomes. Statistics replaced stories. Numbers traveled upward through bureaucracies, stripped of context. At no point did the system require acknowledgement of suffering as suffering. Pain was translated into data. For prisoners, this abstraction was devastating. To be reduced to a number was not merely symbolic, it dictated survival. Numbers determined rations, assignments, and medical decisions. Identity became irrelevant. Individual history vanished. Memory itself was endangered. Yet memory persisted in fragments. Prisoners memorized names. They recalled birthdays, addresses, childhood streets. These recollections functioned as acts of resistance. Remembering who one had been countered the system's attempt to define who one was allowed to be. Time inside the camp distorted perception. Days blurred into each other. Night offered little relief. Exhaustion eroded cognitive clarity. Under such conditions, moral choices narrowed. Survival became immediate. Ethical reflection became a luxury few could afford. Judging actions taken under such pressure required humility. After liberation, survivors encountered a world unprepared to receive them. Many returned to communities that no longer existed. Homes were occupied or destroyed. Families were gone. Documentation was missing.
The past could not be restored, only mourned. The expectation that survivors would simply resume life revealed a profound misunderstanding of trauma. Survival did not erase injury, it prolonged it. The body carried damage invisible to outsiders. The mind replayed scenes without warning. Normality became elusive. Medical professionals struggled to address these wounds. Trauma was poorly understood. Psychological suffering was often dismissed. Survivors were encouraged to move on, to be grateful, to rebuild without dwelling on memory. Silence was incentivized. This silence shaped post-war societies. Many nations prioritized reconstruction over reckoning. Trials focused narrowly on top officials, leaving broader participation unexamined. Collective responsibility dissolved into individual scapegoats. The system that enabled atrocity remained largely intact. It was only later that attention shifted toward structural analysis. Scholars began examining how ordinary institutions facilitated genocide. Universities, corporations, hospitals, and churches were scrutinized. The Holocaust was no longer viewed solely as a failure of morality, but as a failure of systems. This shift was uncomfortable. It implicated professionals who had never worn uniforms or carried weapons, accountants who balanced budgets, engineers who optimized layouts, doctors who adhered to protocols. Responsibility expanded beyond obvious perpetrators. Education became a battleground for this expanded understanding. Should students learn names and dates, or mechanisms in mournings? Should emphasis rest on victim suffering or on perpetrators' choices? Different approaches reflected different moral priorities. Museums grappled with these questions physically. Exhibition design became ethical terrain. How much detail was too much? How much abstraction too little? Objects carried weight. Shoes, suitcases, glasses. Mundane items transformed into witnesses. These objects resisted narrative closure. They did not explain, they confronted. Their presence demanded attention without offering resolution. Viewers were left to supply meaning, a task that often provoked discomfort. Discomfort, however, was essential. Comfort risked trivialization. When history becomes palatable, it loses urgency. Auschwitz resisted palatability. Any attempt to soften it distorted its truth. Survivor testimony reintroduced human voice into this landscape. Each account differed. Memory proved unreliable yet indispensable. Contradictions emerged. Details blurred. These imperfections did not weaken testimony. They reinforced its authenticity. Trauma does not produce clean narratives. The act of testimony itself was double-edged. Speaking relieved isolation but reopened wounds. Survivors balanced the need to remember against the desire to forget. Public demand for stories sometimes felt extractive. Pain became content. Eva Moses Core navigated this tension consciously. She rejected being consumed by expectation. Her insistence on autonomy unsettled audiences accustomed to passive survivors. She reminded listeners that survival did not obligate adherence to prescribed narratives. Her confrontation with former perpetrators challenged simplistic moral binaries. Forgiveness in her framing was not absolution, it was self-determination. This distinction was often misunderstood. Critics accused her of minimizing crimes. Supporters saw empowerment. The debate itself revealed unresolved anxieties about justice. Justice after mass atrocity proved elusive. Legal systems struggled with scale. Punishment felt inadequate. Many perpetrators lived ordinary lives. The disparity between harm inflicted and consequences imposed haunts survivors and observers alike. This imbalance fueled philosophical inquiry. Could justice exist after genocide? Was remembrance a substitute or a supplement? Did acknowledgement matter if accountability was incomplete? These questions resisted definitive answers. Generational transmission added complexity. Children of survivors inherited memories indirectly. Silence communicated as powerfully as speech. Trauma shaped family dynamics. Anxiety traveled across time. Third and fourth generations engaged differently. Distance allowed analysis but risked detachment. Memory shifted from lived experience to moral symbol. This transition demanded care. Symbolism without specificity invites misuse. Political actors occasionally exploited Holocaust memory. Analogies were drawn carelessly. Historical precision eroded. Survivors warned against this erosion. Comparison without context flattened meaning. Yet refusing all comparison risked isolating the Holocaust as anomaly. Balance was required. The Holocaust was both singular and instructive. Its mechanisms echoed elsewhere even when outcomes differed. Genocide prevention frameworks emerged, informed by this balance. Early warning indicators were identified: dehumanizing rhetoric, legal exclusion, media manipulation, centralization of power. These patterns recurred with unsettling regularity. Despite this knowledge, prevention remained inconsistent. Interests intervened. Fatigue dulled response. The lesson of Auschwitz, that delay is deadly, was learned repeatedly and ignored repeatedly. This cycle underscored a sobering reality. Knowledge alone does not compel action. Ethical systems require reinforcement through incentives, institutions, and culture. Without these supports, memory fades into ritual. Ritual itself posed risks. Commemorations could become performative, words repeated without reflection. Phrases like never again risked becoming ceremonial rather than operational. Operational memory demanded engagement with present conditions. It required asking uncomfortable questions about power, obedience, and conformity. It required examining contemporary institutions through historical lenses. Auschwitz thus remained unfinished business, not because facts were unknown, but because implications were ongoing. The camp existed as a warning embedded in modernity's foundation. Its relevance extended beyond genocide. It illuminated dangers inherent in technocratic thinking detached from ethics. When efficiency becomes an end rather than a tool, human value erodes. The camp demonstrated how quickly exceptional measures become normalized. Emergency justifications persist. Temporary suspensions of rights extend indefinitely. Language adjusts. Resistance diminishes. Understanding this process required vigilance not only against overt hatred, but against subtle shifts, against jokes that dehumanize, against policies that categorize, against indifference disguised as pragmatism. The Holocaust taught that evil rarely announces itself dramatically. It advances incrementally, wrapped in rationalizations. Each step appears tolerable until the cumulative effect becomes catastrophic. This incrementalism explained why so many failed to intervene early. No single moment felt decisive. Responsibility dissolved across time. By the time clarity emerged, options narrowed. Education that focused solely on outcomes missed this lesson. The true warning lay not only in what happened, but in how it became possible. As survivor numbers dwindled, stewardship of this warning transferred fully to institutions and individuals removed from direct experience. Accuracy became paramount. Sensationalism threatened understanding. Scholars emphasized process over spectacle, mechanism over monstrosity. This shift reframed the Holocaust as a case study in systemic failure rather than isolated barbarism. Such framing was unsettling because it implicated the present. It suggested that under certain conditions, similar systems could re-emerge, not identically but functionally. This implication resisted comfort. It challenged narratives of moral progress. It demanded humility regarding human nature. The endurance of Auschwitz and collective memory stemmed from this challenge. It refused closure because closure implied safety. The past was not sealed, it was instructive. And so the narrative continued, not as a chronicle of death, but as an examination of structures that govern life. Wherever systems prioritize function over dignity, the questions raised by Auschwitz resurfaced. Wherever obedience eclipses conscience, echoes emerge. Wherever efficiency silences empathy, warning signs appear. The history did not end, it persisted as inquiry. As decades passed, Auschwitz transformed from a geographic location into a conceptual framework through which modern societies examine themselves. It ceased to be only a crime scene and became a diagnostic tool. The question shifted from what happened to how it was allowed to happen, and more disturbingly, why so many systems functioned exactly as designed. The bureaucratic nature of the camp exposed an uncomfortable truth. Atrocity does not require chaos, fanaticism, or emotional frenzy. It can thrive in calm offices, under fluorescent lights, within neatly typed forms. The machinery of genocide depended less on hatred than on compliance, less on rage than on routine. This realization destabilized comforting myths about evil being easily recognizable. Many post-war institutions resisted this conclusion. It was easier to portray perpetrators as aberrations than to acknowledge systemic vulnerability. Exceptionalism provided psychological insulation. If Auschwitz was unique, then it was irrelevant. If it was monstrous beyond comparison, then it could not recur.